Hi, I'm Ven. Welcome to my book corner. Today we're taking a look at The Space Between Worlds by Micaiah Johnson. This is a multiversal tale, which is all the rage at the moment on TV and film in particular. This came out in August of 2020 and is 336 pages long. As always, we shall take a look at the story, the characters, the world building, as well as the book's presentation, before I give my final thoughts at the end. And finally, if you enjoy this video, please drop a like down below. It really helps out. So with all that out of the way, let's just jump straight into this multiversal tale. Okay, so the story and plot of this is a relatively straightforward one in many regards. We are following Cara. Now, Cara's job is a traverser, and what a traverser is somebody that can, as a job, step from one reality to another to alternative worlds. And her job is basically to go to these alternative worlds and collect data caches that have been basically keeping an eye on things that are going on there and fetching it back for analysts to then study. And she is one of the most prominent traversers at this moment in time. Now, there's a few interesting things that need to be mentioned here. First of all, this is set in a dystopian future where the Earth's climate has been ravaged. It's not said outright, but the ozone layer is at least implied to be incredibly thin, as living outside the walled cities is mentioned to be incredibly dangerous just because of the heat and the burn that you can get very easily. And there is a two-tier society going on here. You have the walled cities. In this case, this is set in Wiley City, which are very much almost man-made utopias, very climate controlled, almost like a domed ecosystem. And then you have the external lands, or in this place it's called Ashtown, which is very much a second-class, I can't even use the word citizenry because they don't have a citizen status, but it's an alternative society that operates outside of the cities, where people are a little bit more hardened, it's a little bit more lawless, a little bit more evangelical in many regards as well. And you have Cara, who is originally from Ashtown, which is outside of the city, and she's trying to gain citizenship, but she's afraid that the traverse job is soon to become an automated one. So she's getting ready for a test to become an analyst so she can analyze the data that's brought back. However, during one of her last jumps, she's uncovered some unsettling information, and she begins to unravel a bit of a conspiracy about the true nature of traversing and what it actually means, and also why it seems that only this reality has actually developed this technology. The framing device of the traversal is really interesting here, and I'm going to touch a bit more when we get to world building on some of it, because that really does inform a lot of what's going on. But overall, the idea of the multiple universes and people going between to collect data, but there being something holding those other universes back in terms of technology, is actually an interesting and quite a strong framework to build this story around. I would be remiss to talk about characters without first mentioning what I think is a major theme in this, and that is the argument of nature versus nurture, in which has more of an effect on how we end up as people. And it's a really interesting idea to take a look at with the multiversal aspect at play, as multiple of the characters you meet more than one version of. And this very much feels like it comes down on the nature side of things. Some of the key characters in the Prime universe, we'll call it the base universe where this is set, when you go into the alternative universes, even though they have very, very different upbringings and histories, although they often start at more or less the same point, but their circumstances diverge quite wildly in some cases. Quite often their actual character traits are the same, which is leaning more into the idea that we have a natural base which is our primary driver in terms of our behaviours. But there are some difference between some of the characters, and I'm not going to go into too much detail with the side characters here, as it's a bit difficult to do so without spoiling the book itself. The main character, Cara, however, is a bit of a mixed bag. She's ambitious, she's smart, and she's resourceful. This is all clearly laid out early on. She likes to wind up and needle her handler, Del, who she has romantic feelings for. And there are a number of twists and turns in that dynamic as well the further into the book that you get. But there's a point about halfway through the book where Cara makes a major decision, and it feels like the decision is made just to force the plot forward, rather than it being what her character would naturally do. And that's a shame. You can explain it away because of the nature of the multiversal travel and some of the inbuilt guilt that she has developed at this point. But for me personally, it felt like a flip of character in the second half of the book. On saying that though, the real interesting dynamics is the ones that she has with the other and alternative characters that you meet throughout the title. The only other character I want to mention is Jean. Jean is again a former traverser in this case, and quite a senior mentor within the organisation that trains traversers, and very much he has been mentoring Cara specifically for a specific job role without her realising. And he's very much a fatherly figure. Now, he doesn't appear as any alternative version within the book, interestingly enough. And again, just like a lot of the other characters, there is a twist to his character which you don't necessarily see coming, and is quite dark in many regards. Overall, I like the differences between the alternative versions. I think it's an interesting take on the idea of nature being your driving force. Cara, on the other hand, I did find quite inconsistent at times, and overall, especially in the first half of the book, I didn't find it particularly likeable either, unfortunately. The world building for this is actually really strong, and it kind of needs to be because of the nature of the story. You've got some interesting mythology, for example, around the traversers themselves, and also there's some really important facts that are established very early on about how traversal works. The idea is that when you go to another universe, you can only go there if you do not exist there anymore. You have to be dead. And that's why Cara is so unique, because in nearly every universe, her other selves have already passed away. They've been murdered or died, or something has happened. So when they're finding people to act as traversers, quite often these are people who live in Ashtown, which is a bit more rough and ready and more likely to have died at a younger age before they can get a chance to be a traverser. And what happens when you bounce into those universes where you still exist is interesting as well. It almost feels like you're a virus bouncing into that universe, and that universe's antibodies basically destroy you as a virus. They reject you. And because of that, the idea of a mythology has sprung up between traversers. And it's never made clear if the goddess is real or just hallucination. But there is interaction with the goddess of traversers in this at one point. But again, it could just be the stresses on the human body. You also have some subtle differences in the way that various different places in the worlds work versus each other as well. So, for example, you've got different geopolitical organizations in one world to another. You have some very subtle differences. So you could have one corporation in one universe and a different one in another, and all these things help differentiate stuff. But the strongest part of this is the sort of side building of the main universe itself, and a lot of this is very subtly done. It's clear that something catastrophic has happened in the world at some point in the past. This universe does not have access to firearms anymore. That technology has been deliberately destroyed, which could suggest that war may have caused a lot of the damage. Also, you get the impression that this Earth 1 is very resource starved. It's mentioned that they fetch resources through from the other worlds, presumably without those worlds knowing about it. And that suggests that there's been overmining and therefore probable climate change caused by pollution because of the burning of fossil fuels, so on and so forth. So that's suggested, although never outright stated. And there's a few other things as well, things like the importance of colour, and there's very much a focus on colour throughout the title. A good example of this is the idea that people in Riley City will quite often wear light grey or white suits. But you can't wear that in Ashtown because it's so dusty and dirty and it'll just get stained. And the idea of someone walking around Ashtown wearing this sort of bright white business suits sort of very clearly marks them as an outsider, as well as the difference in complexion and skin and so on and so forth, as the people outside the walled cities are a lot more weather beaten in many regards as well. You have interesting power structures and how different they are between Wiley City and Ashtown as well. And overall, there is a lot here to differentiate not only the different worlds in alternative versions, but Wiley City and Ashtown are very much two sides of a very, very, very different coin. They both, however, rely on each other in many ways as well, and some of those ways are quite subtle and often quite underhanded. So the world building really does make this title, and it is excellent throughout. I don't have a huge amount to say in terms of presentation. There are a couple of bits, however. The first thing is, as already mentioned, this is 336 pages. It felt like a much longer book. Now, I'm running into this problem more often with sci-fi than other genres, and I'm wondering if that's just a preference on my part. It might simply be a case that I indulge in sci-fi better in a visual medium than I do in written. That being said, there are a few other things of interest in here. In terms of the pacing, this book is split into 4 clear quarters, and the end of the first 3 quarters has a clear, not quite a cliffhanger, but it has a clear change to the status quo at the end of each of the first 3 quarters. And that helps to inform the next quarter and gives you enough of an idea of what to expect in the next part of the book. Now, that being said, the first half of the book felt almost painfully slow to me at times, whereas the ending of the book, the last quarter, felt a bit too quick, so there's a bit of unevenness there. It felt like the last quarter should have been extended slightly to have a bit more of a payoff, because the payoff felt a bit of a damp ending in many regards to me personally. But on the flip side, the descriptive work in here is very good, and the character writing overall, if you ignore Cara, is very, very strong. You have a clear delineation between the various different versions of a character, and quite often those differences are subtle, but they're there, and you can look at the characters and go, oh, I can see how you ended up there instead of there, and vice versa. So that's really well done as well. Overall, this is a very strongly written book that's incredibly descriptive and does a good job on some very subtle nuance with the characters. So I have complicated thoughts on this one. First off, the positives. So in terms of the idea of this, the idea that someone's job is to physically go to another world, collect the data cache, come back in that world to be analysed is an interesting one, especially when you bear in mind the fact that those worlds don't have the same ability, and the question of why is a very, very subtle underlying thread throughout all of this. You have some very, very strong world building, be that passive or subtle world building, or at very much show and tell world building as well. Quite blunt force in places is really, really good. You have some really strong nuanced character work on the side characters, showing the very subtle differences between multiple versions of the same character. And on top of that, you have the idea of splitting this into 4 clean quarters, with each one ending on something that should change the status quo of the story being told. Now, all that being said, even though you have those 4 quarters, the pacing of this is quite uneven, especially when you hit the last quarter, which is far faster paced than the rest of the title and actually lacks a little bit of space to breathe. The main character of Cara as well lacks a lot of the subtlety that the other character work has in the book, largely because there's not as much to play off as an alternative to her in many regards, and some of the decisions that she makes throughout the title don't necessarily make sense. And also, because of the amount of world building that goes into this, it can feel quite laborious to read at times. It felt a lot longer than the 336 pages that it is, because it is so dense, and again, that kind of tanks the pacing of the story overall. But again, the premise of it and the world building and the character work overall is good enough to pull it through. It lands it in a solid C tier for me personally. There's enough here that I will probably try to read the follow-up book when it comes out next year. But that's my thoughts on this. I'd love to know yours. Let me know in the comments below. I'll catch you next time.